Hidden in the misty Appalachian Mountains, an ancient journal holds secrets of forbidden love, betrayal, and a curse that spans generations. Helen, a history professor searching for her roots, and Sam, a brooding poet, find themselves tangled in a mystery that could change their lives forever. But at what cost? Are they ready to face the truth and risk everything for love? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. The early morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees surrounding the cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Helen Carter stood in the middle of her late father's cabin, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she surveyed the room filled with old books, mismatched furniture, and the faint scent of pine. Her life in Asheville felt distant here, divorced, overworked, and wondering what her purpose was now that the life she'd built had unraveled. This cabin, with its creaky floors and warm familiarity, was supposed to be a retreat, a chance to clear her head. Instead, it offered her something far more intriguing. It started with an old trunk tucked away in the corner of the bedroom. The leather-bound journal she'd found inside was aged, but remarkably well preserved, its yellowed pages filled with elegant script. The cryptic poems were haunting, filled with longing, betrayal, and something that felt like unfinished business. One poem in particular caught her attention. Words of truth buried in stone, in shadows they wait, forgotten, alone. Follow the echoes, listen for the call. A curse binds the heart, awaiting its fall. Helen's fingers lingered on the page, her heart pounding with questions. Who was this poet? Why did her father keep this hidden? And why did it feel so personal? The next day, Helen found herself in town, the journal tucked securely in her bag. The quaint streets of Blue Ridge Falls buzzed with the sound of locals greeting one another, their southern accents warm and inviting. A bookstore near the corner of Main Street caught her eye, its window displaying a sign that read, "Local History Tours with Sam McAllister. Learn the secrets of Blue Ridge." Inside, the smell of old paper and coffee greeted her. Helen approached the counter where a tall, rugged man with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes stood organizing a stack of books. "Excuse me," she began hesitantly. "Are you Sam McAllister?" The man looked up, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Depends on who's asking." Helen straightened, brushing off the abruptness. "My name's Helen Carter. I found something that might be tied to local history, and I was hoping you could help me interpret it." Sam raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "What is it? A piece of pottery? A family tree?" "A journal," Helen replied, setting it carefully on the counter. "It belonged to a poet from the 1800s. The poems mention places around here." Sam's expression didn't change, but he reached for the journal, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. After a few moments, he closed it and crossed his arms. "Looks interesting," he said gruffly, "but I'm not a museum guide. If you're looking for someone to wax poetic about this, I'm sure the university has plenty of professors who'd be thrilled." Helen felt her frustration rise. "I'm not looking for a lecture, Mr. McAllister. I need someone who knows the local history, someone who can connect these poems to real places." Sam studied her for a moment before letting out a resigned sigh. "Fine, but don't expect me to sugarcoat anything. This poet of yours was probably just another rich landowner who had too much time on his hands." Helen frowned but nodded. "That's all I ask. Honesty." Their first stop was an overgrown trail just outside of town where Sam claimed one of the poet's landmarks might be found. The walk was quiet at first, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a bird. "Why do this?" Sam asked abruptly, breaking the silence. Helen glanced at him. "Do what?" "Dig into this journal. People like you usually come here looking for nostalgia, not answers." Helen hesitated before replying. "Because it's all I have left of my father. He must have kept it for a reason." Sam's expression softened briefly, but he quickly masked it. "Fair enough." They reached a clearing where a crumbling stone wall stood half hidden by ivy. Sam gestured toward it. "This matches the description in your poem. The stones were probably part of an old homestead." Helen stepped closer, her fingers brushing over the cool, rough surface. She could almost feel the weight of history pressing against her palms. "Do you believe in curses?" she asked suddenly, turning to Sam. He smirked. "I believe in bad decisions and consequences. Curses? Not so much." Helen smiled faintly. "Then let's hope you're right." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they made their way back to town. Despite Sam's gruff demeanor, Helen found herself intrigued by him. There was a quiet intensity in his voice when he spoke about the land, a passion she hadn't expected. Sam, meanwhile, couldn't help but admire Helen's determination. She was sharp, unyielding, and clearly not the type to be intimidated. By the time they parted ways, there was an unspoken agreement between them. The journal was only the beginning, and neither of them could deny the pull it had on their lives. Helen stared at the journal on the cabin's old oak table, her fingers drumming against its weathered leather cover. The words inside still felt alive, humming with a quiet urgency, but the more she tried to make sense of them, the more she wondered if this was all just nothing, a relic of someone else's obsession. Sam's words from the day before echoed in her mind. Probably just another rich landowner with too much time on his hands. With a frustrated sigh, she pushed the journal away. Maybe Sam was right. Maybe this wasn't worth chasing. But that night, the dreams began. Helen stood in a foggy field, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. A figure emerged in the distance, a man with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. He whispered something, but the words were drowned out by the wind. As she moved closer, the field transformed into a grand estate with flickering gas lamps illuminating the grounds. The man was gone, replaced by a woman dressed in 19th century finery. Her lips trembled as she held a crumpled letter against her chest, tears streaking her pale face. Suddenly the woman turned, her eyes locking with Helen's. Her voice, barely audible, whispered, "Help me." Helen woke with a start, her chest tight and her heart pounding. The next morning, Helen found Sam at his usual spot in the town's small cafe, a coffee cup in one hand and a notebook in the other. His pen hovered over the page, his expression distant. She hesitated before sliding into the seat across from him. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning." Helen folded her hands on the table, studying him. "What are you writing?" Sam smirked, finally glancing up. "Nothing worth reading," Helen frowned. "You're a writer. Surely it's something." "Used to be a writer," he corrected, closing the notebook. "Now I'm just a guy who gives history tours and humors strangers with journals." Helen ignored the jab, pulling the journal from her bag and setting it on the table. "I think there's more to this than we thought." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. It spoke to you in a dream?" Helen bristled. "You don't have to be sarcastic." Sam sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, Helen, this place, these mountains, they're full of stories. Some true, most exaggerated. You're chasing shadows. And frankly, I'm not sure why you care so much." "Because it's my father's," she snapped, her voice rising. A few patrons glanced their way, but she didn't care. "He kept this for a reason, and I need to know why." Sam studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Fine," he said finally. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Their next stop was the town's library, a cozy building with creaking floors and shelves that smelled of old paper. Sam led her to a small section dedicated to local history, pulling out a thin volume bound in faded green cloth. "Legends of Blue Ridge Falls," he said, handing it to her. "If you want to know the stories, start here." Helen flipped through the pages, her eyes catching on titles like The Miner's Curse and The Bride Who Vanished. One chapter, The Poet's Lament, made her pause. "What's this one about?" she asked, holding up the book. Sam hesitated, his expression darkening. "Thomas Matheson, a local poet who supposedly went mad after losing the woman he loved. Some say he killed himself. Others think he cursed the land before he died." Helen's pulse quickened. "Cursed the land?" Sam shrugged. "That's what the story says. But like I said, most of this stuff is exaggerated." Helen frowned, flipping to the chapter and skimming the first few paragraphs. The details were sparse, but something about the name Thomas Matheson felt familiar. That night, the dreams returned. This time, Helen stood inside a grand estate, its walls lined with books and paintings. The woman from before was there, her dress tattered and her face pale. "He'll come for you," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Helen turned, her heart racing, but before she could respond, the ground beneath her feet crumbled, plunging her into darkness. She woke gasping, her hands clutching the sheets. The next day, Helen and Sam visited one of the landmarks mentioned in the journal, a stone bridge that spanned a narrow creek. Sam explained that the bridge had been built in the late 1800s, around the time Matheson had lived. Helen ran her fingers along the weathered stones, feeling a strange connection to the place. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if the stories we tell are just fragments of something bigger? Something we're not meant to understand?" Sam gave her a sidelong glance. "You're starting to sound like one of the locals." Helen smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was more than just a family heirloom. The dreams, the stories, the places, they all felt connected, as if pulling her towards something she wasn't yet ready to face. And though Sam still carried his skepticism like armor, Helen sensed a shift in him, a quiet curiosity that mirrored her own. The call had been made. Whether they answered it or not was still uncertain. The soft hum of the car engine was the only sound as Helen and Sam drove along the winding mountain road. The journal rested on Helen's lap, its weight a quiet reminder of their reluctant partnership. "So," Sam began, breaking the silence, "what exactly are we looking for again?" Helen glanced at him, her grip tightening on the journal. "Connections. Something that proves this poet wasn't just writing flowery nonsense. Something tangible." Sam smirked. "Tangible, huh? Like ghosts and curses?" Helen rolled her eyes, biting back a retort. Instead, she turned her attention to the map spread across the dashboard. "Our first stop is the coal mine. One of the poems mentions dark veins that bled the land. That has to mean something." Sam sighed but kept his focus on the road. "Let's hope it's worth all this effort." The abandoned coal mine was nestled deep in the forest, its entrance half hidden by overgrown ivy and crumbling wooden beams. Helen stepped out of the car, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs as she surveyed the eerie sight. "Not exactly a tourist hotspot," Sam muttered, grabbing a flashlight from the trunk. Helen ignored his sarcasm, her eyes drawn to the rusted tracks leading into the mine. "It's incredible to think how many lives were tied to places like this," she said softly. Sam nodded, his tone uncharacteristically serious. "A lot of lives ended here too. Mining was dangerous work, especially back then." As they ventured inside, the cool air grew damp, and the echo of their footsteps seemed to amplify in the narrow tunnel. Helen held the journal tightly, flipping to the poem that had brought them here. "Beneath the earth where shadows weep, the secrets buried, the stories keep." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried in the stillness. "Poetic," Sam said, shining his flashlight on the walls, "but not exactly helpful." Helen paused, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of the rock. "Maybe not yet, but I feel like we're close to something." Their next stop was the historic church, a modest stone building perched on a hill overlooking the valley. The air felt heavier here, the kind of weight that came from years of prayers and whispers carried on the wind. Inside, the wooden pews were worn smooth from decades of use, and stained glass windows cast fragmented light across the floor. Helen walked slowly down the aisle, the journal open in her hands. Through windows of crimson and gold, her gaze lingers, a story untold. Sam stood near the doorway, his arms crossed. "What are we looking for?" Helen scanned the walls, her eyes catching on a faded painting near the altar. It was barely discernible, the colors muted with age, but the figure of a woman was clear, a woman with dark hair and sorrowful eyes, staring out as if she held a secret too heavy to bear. "This," Helen breathed, stepping closer. "It matches the description in the journal." Sam joined her, tilting his head as he studied the painting. "You think this is her? The woman in the poems?" Helen nodded, her heart racing. "It has to be. Whoever she was, she meant something to him." As they left the church, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Helen leaned against the car, her mind buzzing with questions. "I don't know what it is about this," she said, her voice quiet, "but it feels like we're unraveling something important." Sam glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're not just chasing answers for your father, are you?" Helen hesitated before answering. "No, I think I'm chasing them for myself, too." Sam nodded, his gaze distant. "I get it. When my mom passed, I stopped writing. I couldn't see the point anymore. But sometimes the things we run from are the things we need most." Helen looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "Do you ever think about starting again?" Sam shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe, if I had the right reason." Their final stop of the day was the derelict plantation house, its grand facade crumbling with time. The long driveway was lined with overgrown oaks, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows in the fading light. "This place gives me the creeps," Sam admitted as they approached the front door. Helen smiled faintly. "Good thing you're here to protect me." Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. Helen flipped through the journal, stopping at a passage that mentioned walls that whispered of sins unspoken. "This house has history," she said, her voice reverent. "You can feel it." Sam scoffed but followed her into the parlor, where the faint outline of a fireplace was barely visible beneath layers of grime. As they explored, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by a person but by the house itself. Every creak, every shadow seemed to hum with unseen energy. "Find anything?" Sam called from the other room. "Not yet," Helen replied, her fingers brushing against the peeling wallpaper. But deep down, she knew they were only scratching the surface of what this journey would uncover. The lingering weight of the discovery at the church hung in the air as Helen and Sam returned to the cabin. The faded painting, with its sorrowful eyes and haunting connection to the journal, had left them with more questions than answers. Helen sat at the cabin's table that evening, flipping through the journal's pages, her brow furrowed. "It's all so fragmented," she muttered half to herself. Sam leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "Sometimes the pieces don't come together until you stop trying so hard," he said, his voice softer than usual. Helen glanced up, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Then maybe we need to listen to the stories people remember, not just the ones written down." The next night, they made their way to a local storytelling event hosted in the town square. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd. An elderly woman with silver hair and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders sat at the center, her voice rich with the cadence of someone used to weaving tales. She began with a story of forbidden love between a wealthy plantation owner's daughter and a coal miner's son. Their love, she said, had been hidden in shadows, doomed by the bitter divide between their families. When their secret was uncovered, betrayal and tragedy followed. Helen leaned closer to Sam, her whisper barely audible. "This sounds like the poems in the journal." Sam nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's eerie how much it matches." The woman's voice softened as she reached the story's end. "Some say their love cursed the land, and their spirits still wander, searching for the forgiveness they never found in life." After the event, Helen approached the storyteller, her journal tucked under her arm. "Your story tonight, it felt so familiar," she said, her voice careful. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with age-old wisdom. "Stories like that have a way of finding those who need them most." Helen hesitated, then asked, "Do you believe in curses?" The woman's smile faded, replaced by something somber. "Curses aren't always about magic," she said. "Sometimes they're just the weight of what we carry and what we pass on." A few days later, Helen and Sam found themselves at the entrance to an abandoned coal mine, one that matched the description from both the journal and the woman's tale. The air was thick with moisture, the faint scent of earth and rust lingering. "This place feels wrong," Sam muttered, gripping a flashlight as they stepped inside. Helen didn't respond. She was too focused on the journal, tracing the words with her fingers as if they might light the way. As they ventured deeper, the path narrowed, and Helen's foot caught on an exposed root. She stumbled, her arms flailing for balance as she teetered dangerously close to the edge of a dark shaft. "Watch out!" Sam shouted, lunging forward. His hands closed around her arm, pulling her back just in time. They collapsed onto the rocky ground, Helen's chest heaving as she clung to him. I didn't see it," she stammered. Sam's grip on her tightened briefly before he let go, his voice steady. "You need to be more careful. This isn't a game." Helen looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I know that, but thank you for catching me." Sam nodded, his expression unreadable, but his hand lingered on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. The plantation house loomed before them later that afternoon, its weathered facade somehow more imposing in the pale light. Inside, the air was heavy, each creak of the floorboards echoing through the empty halls. Helen ran her fingers along the walls, her gaze sharp as she searched for something, anything that might connect to the journal's cryptic verses. "Here!" Sam called from the far end of the room. Helen hurried over to find him crouched by the base of a bookshelf. A small compartment had been pried open, revealing a bundle of yellowed papers tied with twine. Carefully, Helen untied the bundle and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was familiar. It matched the journal. "It's addressed to the poet," she murmured, her heart racing. Sam peered over her shoulder, his voice low. "What does it say?" Helen read aloud, her voice trembling. "To my beloved, I cannot undo the sins of my father, nor the blood spilled in his name. But know this, I will wait for you, even beyond the veil of this world. Forgive me for all I could not be in this life." The room seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in around them. This changes everything," Helen whispered. Sam's gaze lingered on her, a mix of curiosity and concern. "It's not just about the poet anymore, is it?" "No," Helen said, clutching the letter tightly. "It's about the lives that were destroyed, and the ones still trying to find peace." As they left the house, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. Helen and Sam walked side by side, the unspoken tension between them palpable. "Do you think they ever found peace?" Helen asked quietly. Sam glanced at her, his voice softer than usual. "Maybe they're still waiting for someone to give it to them." Helen nodded, her mind racing. She wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but one thing was certain. She couldn't turn back now. The air in the cabin felt heavy, as though the weight of the day's discoveries had settled into every creak of the floorboards and flicker of the oil lamp. Helen sat at the table, the journal open in front of her, its pages illuminated by the soft amber glow. Sam leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching her with an intensity she found both frustrating and comforting. "What are you looking for exactly?" he asked, his voice low. Helen traced a finger over a line of faded script. "There's something here. Something I'm missing." Sam sighed, walking over and pulling out a chair. "You're running yourself into the ground with this." Helen looked up at him, her frustration bubbling over. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just some puzzle to me. It feels personal." Sam held her gaze for a moment before looking away. "Maybe too personal." Later that night, Helen lay awake in the small bed, the journal resting on the nightstand beside her. Sleep eluded her, her mind churning with questions. When she finally drifted off, the dreams returned. This time the vision was clearer. She stood in the same grand estate she had seen before, the walls adorned with tapestries and gilded mirrors. The woman from her earlier dreams was there, her eyes filled with sorrow as she reached out a trembling hand. "They won't let us be," the woman whispered. "The curse will follow you, as it has followed me." Helen jolted awake, her breathing ragged. The words lingered in her mind, sharp and insistent. The next morning, Helen and Sam sat on the porch, the journal spread between them. Helen tapped on one of the poems, her voice firm. "This one, it mentions a line that carries loss." Sam squinted at the page, his brow furrowed. "A family curse? That's what you're thinking?" Helen nodded. "It makes sense. The betrayal, the tragedy. What if this poet's curse wasn't just a metaphor?" Sam leaned back, his arms crossed. "You're suggesting what? That your family's tied to this somehow?" Helen hesitated. "I don't know, but what if they are?" Sam shook his head, his voice rising. "You're chasing ghosts, Helen. At some point, you have to ask yourself if it's worth it. Helen stood, her frustration boiling over. You don't get to decide what's worth it to me. This is my family, my history. Sam rose to meet her, his expression stormy. And where does it end? What happens if you don't like the answers you find? For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Then, as though drawn by an unseen force, Helen stepped closer. You're right, she said softly. I don't know where it ends, but I can't walk away. Sam stared at her, the tension between them palpable. And then, before either of them could second-guess it, he kissed her. It was a kiss born of frustration and longing, a clash of emotions that had been building since the moment they met. Helen's hands found their way to his shoulders, her grip firm as though anchoring herself to him. But just as quickly as it began, Sam pulled away, his breath ragged. I'm sorry, he muttered, stepping back. I can't do this. Helen blinked, her heart pounding. Sam, I shouldn't have, he interrupted, shaking his head. I'm sorry. Without another word, he walked back into the cabin, leaving Helen standing alone on the porch, the taste of his kiss still lingering. That night, the dreams returned with a vengeance. The woman in the estate was no longer alone. A man stood beside her, his face shadowed but his voice unmistakable. Help her, he said, his tone a mix of desperation and command. Finish what I could not. Helen woke with a start, the words ringing in her ears. She didn't know who the man was or what he wanted from her, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't turn back now. The following morning was quiet, the tension from the night before lingering like the last echoes of a storm. Helen stood on the cabin's porch, staring out at the rolling mist over the mountains, her thoughts tangled. Sam's retreat after their kiss had left her feeling vulnerable, unsure of where they stood. She was about to return inside when the sharp ring of her phone broke the silence. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something told her to answer. Helen Carter, she said, her voice tentative. This is Dr. Whitaker from the university's history department. The voice on the other end was firm, almost cold. I've heard about your little discovery. I think it's time we discuss how you can contribute it to the academic community. Helen frowned. Contribute? The journal isn't for sale, Dr. Whitaker. Whitaker chuckled, the sound dry and condescending. I'm not sure you understand, Miss Carter. Holding on to something like this without proper preservation could be seen as irresponsible. Imagine the fallout if the public thought you were hoarding a piece of history for personal gain. Her grip on the phone tightened. Are you threatening me? Of course not. I'm simply offering you a chance to do the right thing, for the sake of history. Helen hung up, her pulse racing. The journal felt heavier in her bag now, as though Whitaker's words had turned it into a ticking time bomb. When Sam arrived later that afternoon, Helen was pacing the cabin's small kitchen, her anxiety palpable. Everything okay? He asked, setting his bag down. Helen stopped mid-step, turning to face him. Whitaker, he called me. He wants the journal, said he'd discredit me if I don't hand it over. Sam's jaw tightened, his easygoing demeanor replaced with a protective edge. He's bluffing. People like him think they can intimidate their way into getting what they want. Helen sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. But what if he's not bluffing? What if he ruins my reputation? What if... Sam crossed the room, his voice steady. Hey, don't let him scare you. This journal, this story, it's yours, and you're not alone in this. Helen looked up at him, her eyes searching his. I don't know why you care so much. After everything. Sam hesitated, his expression softening. Because I see how much it means to you, and because I care about you, Helen. More than I probably should. The words hung between them, unspoken truths finally brought to light. Later that day, they drove to a remote cemetery nestled in the shadow of a wooded hill, following a clue from one of the journal's final poems. The path was overgrown, the headstones weathered and moss-covered. Are you sure this is the right place? Sam asked, brushing aside a low-hanging branch. Helen nodded, clutching the journal tightly. It has to be. The poem mentioned stones that bear the weight of a name long silenced. They wandered among the graves, their footsteps crunching softly against the leaves. Finally, Helen stopped in front of a small, unassuming headstone, its surface worn smooth by time. "It's here," she whispered, pointing to the faint engraving. Sam knelt beside the stone, brushing away the dirt and leaves. The name was barely legible, but the inscription below it was clear. "Lost to the veil, found in the echoes." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "It matches the last line of the journal." Sam looked up at her, his expression a mix of awe and determination. Whoever this poet was, he left this for a reason. It's part of the puzzle, part of the story he needed someone to find. Helen knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the inscription. What if the curse isn't just about loss? What if it's about finding a way to heal? Sam placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "Then we'll find it, together." As they walked back to the car, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Helen felt a renewed sense of purpose, the weight of Whitaker's threats momentarily forgotten. Sam glanced at her, his voice quiet. "You're not giving up, are you?" Helen shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not a chance." And for the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't walking this path alone. The drive back from the cemetery was unusually quiet but not tense. The silence between Helen and Sam was filled with unspoken words, an understanding that neither of them wanted to disturb. As the car wound its way through the shadowed curves of the mountain road, Helen glanced out the window, her thoughts swirling like the mist clinging to the peaks. When they reached the cabin, Helen hesitated before stepping out of the car. "Sam," she began, her voice soft. "Thank you for standing up for me earlier, with Whitaker, and for being here." Sam looked at her, his hand lingering on the door handle. "You don't have to thank me, Helen. I'm here because I want to be." Her heart skipped, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. "I'm glad," she said simply, stepping into the cool evening air. The next morning, Helen woke to the sound of birdsong and the faint rustle of leaves outside the cabin. She found Sam by the porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was rising over the ridges, painting the landscape in hues of orange and gold. "I was thinking," he said without turning around, "we could take a break today, clear our heads." Helen raised an eyebrow. "A break? I didn't think you believed in those." Sam chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Even I need to breathe sometimes. There's a lake not far from here, peaceful, quiet. Might help us think." Helen considered his suggestion, then nodded. "All right, a break it is." The lake was nestled in a hollow, surrounded by towering trees and rocky outcrops. The water was impossibly still, reflecting the clear blue sky and the green canopy above. Sam carried a small picnic basket, and Helen held the journal, always reluctant to leave it behind. They settled by the water's edge, the soft grass beneath them, and the gentle lapping of the lake creating an atmosphere of calm. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the sounds of nature. Helen broke the quiet first. "Do you ever think about what you've left behind?" Sam glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "All the time. But I've learned that running from it doesn't make it go away. It just waits for you to stop." She nodded slowly, staring at the journal in her lap. "I feel like I've been running for a long time. From my marriage, from the life I thought I wanted, maybe even from myself." Sam's voice softened. "You're not running now." Helen met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment the rest of the world faded away, leaving just the two of them by the lake. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam reached out, his hand brushing hers. "So am I. But sometimes fear's just the other side of something worth fighting for." As the afternoon wore on, Helen opened the journal, flipping through its familiar pages. Toward the back, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint indentation beneath the aged paper. Carefully, she peeled back the corner to reveal a fragment of an unfinished poem, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "When the shadow meets the light, the heart must choose its flight. To mend the chain, to break the curse, a cost unknown, for better or worse." Helen read the words aloud, her voice trembling. "It's unfinished." Sam leaned closer, his brow furrowing. What do you think it means? Helen shook her head. I'm not sure, but it feels important, like it's the key to everything. Sam studied her, then the journal. If finishing it could break this so-called curse, then maybe that's what he wanted someone to do, to finish what he couldn't. Helen's fingers tightened on the pages. But what if there's a reason he didn't finish it? What if there's a cost we don't understand? Sam was quiet for a moment before he spoke. That's a question only you can answer, Helen. But whatever you decide, I'll be here. The sun dipped lower in the sky as they packed up their things and began the walk back to the car. The connection between them felt different now, stronger, deeper. It wasn't just the journal or the mystery tying them together. It was something real, something undeniable. As they reached the cabin, Helen paused on the porch, looking up at Sam. Today, it meant a lot to me. You mean a lot to me. Sam hesitated, then reached out, his hand brushing her cheek. You mean a lot to me too, Helen, more than I can put into words. And in that moment, the walls they had both built around their hearts began to crumble. The evening air felt heavier than usual as Helen spread her notes across the cabin's table. The journal lay open in the center, its faded pages surrounded by maps, transcriptions, and her scribbled theories. Her work felt fragile, like a puzzle that might shatter if mishandled. Sam watched her from the kitchen, his usual easy demeanor replaced with quiet concern. You've been staring at that same page for an hour, he said. Helen didn't look up. Because it doesn't make sense. The poem fragment, it's like it's waiting for something. Sam walked over, leaning on the back of her chair. Maybe it's waiting for you to step away for a bit. Helen finally met his gaze, a small smile tugging at her lips. You sound like you're worried about me. Sam's reply was cut short by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Helen frowned, glancing at Sam before moving to the window. It's Whitaker, she said, her voice laced with unease. Dr. Whitaker entered the cabin like he owned it, his polished shoes and tailored suit a stark contrast to the rustic surroundings. Miss Carter, he greeted with a thin smile. Mr. McAllister. Sam crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. What do you want, Whitaker? Whitaker ignored him, his gaze settling on the table. Impressive collection you've gathered here, he said, gesturing to the notes and maps. Helen stepped forward, blocking his view. This is my work. If you've come to pressure me again, you can leave. Whitaker's smile didn't falter. I'm not here to pressure you, Helen. I'm here to warn you. If you continue down this path, you're going to find yourself in over your head. And when that happens, people like me will be the only ones who can help. I don't need your help, Helen said firmly. Whitaker shrugged, his eyes narrowing. We'll see. The next morning, Helen woke to chaos. Her notes were gone. Every page, every map, every transcription. The journal was untouched, but the rest of her work had vanished. What the hell happened? Sam asked as he rushed into the cabin, his face tight with worry. Whitaker, Helen said, her voice trembling with anger. He must have taken them while we were distracted. Sam paced the room, his frustration evident. We should have seen this coming. That bastard's been circling like a vulture since the beginning. Helen sank into a chair, her head in her hands. It's my fault. I should have been more careful. Sam stopped pacing, crouching in front of her. Hey, this isn't on you. We'll figure it out. We'll get your notes back. But Helen shook her head, her expression hardening. I've dragged you into this mess, Sam, and now I think I need to end it. That evening, Helen began packing her things. The journal, the only piece of her research she had left, sat on the table. Sam watched her from the doorway, his jaw clenched. So that's it? He asked, his voice sharp. You're just giving up? Helen paused, her hands trembling as she folded a sweater. I'm protecting you, Sam. Whitaker won't stop, and I can't keep pulling you into my problems. Sam stepped closer, his tone softening. You think I care about Whitaker? I'm here because I care about you, Helen. Don't you get that? Helen turned to face him, her eyes glistening. That's exactly why I have to leave. If anything happened to you because of me. She trailed off, shaking her head. I can't risk it. Sam reached for her hand, but she pulled away. I've made up my mind, Sam. This is the only way. Helen left the cabin just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and red. The journal was tucked safely in her bag, but the weight in her chest was far heavier. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart breaking at the sight of the cabin disappearing behind her. And in that moment, she wasn't sure what hurt more, losing her work or losing Sam. The cabin felt unbearably empty after Helen left. Sam sat in the same chair where she had pored over the journal so many nights, her absence like a physical ache in the room. The journal remained, its weight far heavier than its leather binding suggested. Sam flipped to the unfinished poem, the fragment of words Helen had read aloud still echoing in his mind. To mend the chain, to break the curse, a cost unknown, for better or worse. He had dismissed it as poetic melancholy before, but now it felt like a plea. If there was even a chance it could help Helen or stop Whitaker from further harming her, he had to try. Sam didn't know much about poetry rituals or curses, but he knew how to write. He gathered the journal, a worn notebook and a pen, setting them carefully on the table. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. The poem seemed to resist completion. Every line he attempted felt wrong, the rhythm discordant, the meaning elusive. He pushed through the frustration, the hours blurring as the weight of the task bore down on him. By the time dawn broke, Sam was hunched over the table, his hand cramping and his head pounding. But the page before him was filled. The poem was finished. 2 days later, Sam stood outside Helen's modest house in Asheville, clutching the journal and the completed poem in his hands. The neighborhood was quiet, the soft hum of cicadas blending with the occasional bark of a dog. He hesitated, unsure of what to say or how she'd react, but he didn't come all this way to give up now. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Helen opened it, her eyes widening in surprise. "Sam?" He held out the journal, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "I finished it, the poem. I think it's what you need to break this." Helen stared at him, her emotions flickering between shock, disbelief, and something softer. "You finished it?" she whispered. Sam nodded. "I didn't know what else to do. You said it was important and I—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "I couldn't let you do this alone." Inside, Helen read the poem aloud, her voice trembling as she reached the final lines. "When love is lost and shadows bind, the past can heal if hearts align. Through words unspoken, the chain shall break and life reclaimed for love's own sake." The air in the room felt charged, as though the poem itself had stirred something unseen. Helen looked up at Sam, tears brimming in her eyes. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice breaking. Sam stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I did, because I care about you, because I can't stand to see you hurt." Helen reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "Sam, She stopped, the weight of everything they'd been through crashing over her. He took her hand, his voice gentle. "You don't have to say anything, Helen. I just needed you to know I'm here. For you, for whatever comes next." As they sat together, the journal between them, Helen realized something she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. She wasn't just fighting to uncover the past. She was fighting for a future that included Sam. The curse, the mysteries, the pain, they were all part of the story. But for the first time, Helen felt like she could face them, knowing she wasn't alone. The journal sat between them on Helen's kitchen table, its leather cover worn but resilient, a testament to the history it held. Sam leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes fixed on Helen. "So," he began, breaking the silence, "what's the plan?" Helen sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Whitaker's not going to stop. He's already taken my notes, and if he gets his hands on the journal, he'll bury everything. This isn't just about preserving history for him. It's about control." Sam's jaw tightened. "Then we don't let him win." Helen looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "How? He has resources, connections, and I'm just—" "You're more than just anything," Sam interrupted, his voice firm. "You've come this far. You're not backing down now." Helen took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. We need to confront him, together." They drove to the university the next morning, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Helen clutched the journal tightly, her knuckles white. "You don't have to do this," Sam said, his voice low. Helen glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, I do, and I'm glad you're with me." Dr. Whitaker's office was as imposing as the man himself. Dark wood paneling, shelves lined with leather-bound books, and a desk that seemed more suited for a judge than a historian. He looked up as they entered, his expression cool and calculating. "Miss Carter, Mr. McAllister, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Helen stepped forward, her voice steady. "You know why we're here. You stole my notes, and you've been trying to intimidate me into handing over the journal. It ends now." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk. "I don't know what you're talking about, and even if I did, do you really think you can prove anything?" Sam stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "You've underestimated her, Whitaker. And me. We know what you're trying to do, and we're not going to let you erase the truth just to pad your ego." Whitaker's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "This isn't about ego. It's about ensuring history is preserved properly." Helen held up the journal. "Preserving history isn't about hoarding it away. It's about telling the stories that need to be told. This journal belongs to the people it speaks for, not to you." Whitaker stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he sighed, a flicker of resignation in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, but if you insist on being stubborn, I won't stop you." As they left the office, Helen felt a wave of relief wash over her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time she felt like she could breathe. Sam walked beside her, his hand brushing hers. "You did it," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "We did it," Helen corrected, glancing at him. They stopped outside the university building, the morning sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Helen turned to Sam, her heart pounding. "Sam," she began, her voice trembling, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." He smiled, his eyes softening. "You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." Helen took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. "I have been running for so long, running from my past, from my feelings, from you, but I don't want to run anymore." Sam reached out, cupping her face gently. "You don't have to," he said softly. "I'm here, Helen, and I'm not going anywhere." Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a culmination of everything they had been through together. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, Helen rested her forehead against his. "I love you, Sam," she whispered. He smiled, his voice steady. "I love you too, Helen. More than I ever thought I could." As they walked away from the university hand in hand, Helen felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journal was safe, the truth was within reach, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and faint wood smoke as Helen stood outside the renovated community center in the heart of Asheville. The once abandoned building now buzzed with life, its freshly painted walls and welcoming porch a testament to months of hard work. She adjusted the stack of programs in her hands, her heart fluttering with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Tonight's event, Echoes of the Past, Preserving Appalachian Stories, marked the first of what she hoped would be many celebrations of the region's untold histories. A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "You look like someone hosting their first big gala," Sam teased, walking up the steps with his easy smile. Helen rolled her eyes, though her smile betrayed her fondness. "And you look like someone who's late." Sam held up his hands in mock surrender. "Had to pick up the special delivery." He stepped aside, revealing a box in his arms. Helen tilted her head. "What's that?" Sam set the box down and opened it, revealing a neat stack of hardcover books. The title on the cover read, "Through the Veil, Poetry and Stories Unearthed." Helen's breath caught. "It's published." Sam nodded, his expression soft. "Got the first copies straight from the printer. Thought tonight was the perfect time to share it." She reached out, running her fingers over the embossed title. "Sam, this is incredible." "It's because of you," he said simply. "I wouldn't have written a word if it weren't for everything we've been through." Helen blinked back the sudden sting of tears, her heart swelling. "Thank you." The event began as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the town in a warm golden light. Helen welcomed a crowd of locals, historians, and a few curious visitors, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Tonight, we honor the stories that shaped this place, the ones that almost disappeared and the ones we're still uncovering, she said, holding the journal aloft. This piece of history reminded me that every story deserves to be told, no matter how long it takes to find it. She glanced at Sam, who stood at the edge of the stage, his expression filled with quiet encouragement. As the evening wore on, Helen found herself mingling among the guests, soaking in their enthusiasm. A small group gathered around Sam, asking questions about his new book. Helen watched from a distance, a warm feeling spreading through her. A woman approached her, her silver hair gleaming under the string lights. "This event is lovely," she said, her southern accent soft and lilting. "You've done something special here." Helen smiled. "Thank you, it's been a labor of love." The woman nodded, her gaze kind. "Sometimes it takes a little heartbreak to find what we're truly meant for." Later, as the crowd began to thin, Helen found Sam by the outdoor fire pit, staring into the flickering flames. She approached quietly, sitting beside him on the wooden bench. "Did you notice how many people loved your book?" she asked, nudging his shoulder. Sam smirked. "Not as many as loved your speech." Helen laughed softly, leaning back against the bench. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the night filling the air around them. Finally Helen spoke. "I used to think I was chasing answers, about the journal, my family, everything. But now I think I was looking for a place to belong." Sam turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "And did you find it?" Helen met his gaze, her heart steady. "I think I did," he smiled, reaching for her hand. "Good, because I think we make a pretty great team." Helen squeezed his hand, her chest tightening with emotion. "We do, don't we?" As the last guests departed, Helen and Sam stood on the porch of the community center, watching the glow of taillights disappear into the night. "You know," Helen said, glancing at him, "I think we're just getting started." Sam chuckled, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Sounds like an adventure to me." Helen leaned into him, her heart full. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain or daunting. It felt like an open road waiting to be traveled. Together, the late spring sun filtered through the trees, casting golden streaks across the lawn outside the newly restored Asheville Community Center. A soft breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwoods, and laughter from a small group of children echoed across the open field. Helen adjusted the banner strung above the entrance, the bold letters reading, "Appalachian Voices, a celebration of stories and song." She stepped back to admire it, her lips curving into a smile. It was perfect, not just the banner, but the entire day. Sam appeared beside her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed her one, his easy smile as steady as ever. "You're really going to fuss over that banner all afternoon, aren't you?" Helen shot him a playful glare. "It's not fussing. It's ensuring everything is just right." Sam leaned closer, his voice dropping into that teasing tone she'd come to love. "Everything is just right, Helen. You've made sure of that." She sipped her coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. "It's not just me. This is our work, Sam." He shrugged. "Well, maybe, but you're the reason we're all here today." The community center buzzed with life, every corner alive with activity. Inside, a small crowd had gathered to hear a local folk singer perform songs passed down through generations. In another room, children clustered around an elder who shared stories of mountain life from decades past. Helen wandered through the spaces, greeting familiar faces and marveling at the turnout. As she stepped into the main hall, her heart swelled at the sight of people thumbing through stacks of books, including Sam's newly published collection, Through the Veil. "Excuse me, Miss Carter." Helen turned to see a young woman clutching a notebook, her expression shy but hopeful. "Yes," Helen asked warmly. "I just wanted to thank you. This event, it's amazing. My grandmother grew up in the mountains, and hearing these stories makes me feel like I know her better." Helen blinked back the sudden sting of emotion. "That's exactly why we're doing this. Thank you for sharing that with me." Later in the afternoon, Helen found herself on the center's back porch, overlooking the small garden Sam had insisted they plant together. She leaned on the railing, letting the hum of conversation from inside wash over her. Sam joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Hiding from your own event?" "Just taking a moment," she replied, leaning into his side. He nodded toward the garden. "Remember when you told me you couldn't grow anything to save your life?" Helen laughed softly. "And you told me I just needed to start small. Guess you were right." "Rarely happens," he joked, pressing a kiss to her temple. As the day wound down, Helen and Sam stood together in the main hall, watching as the last of the guests trickled out. The event had been a success, better than Helen had dared to hope. One of the older attendees approached them, her silver hair gleaming in the soft light. "Miss Carter, Mr. McAllister, I just wanted to say how much today meant to me. You've created something truly special here." Helen reached out to squeeze the woman's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The woman smiled warmly. "And to think it all started with a little journal." As she walked away, Helen turned to Sam, her expression thoughtful. "She's right. This all started with the journal, but it's become so much more." Sam nodded, his gaze steady. "Because you refused to give up. You saw the story that needed to be told." Helen reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "We told it together." That evening, as the stars blinked to life above the mountains, Helen and Sam sat on the porch of their home, a cozy cabin they had renovated together. The journal rested on the small table between them, its once mysterious pages now a symbol of everything they had built. Helen stared out at the darkened horizon, her voice quiet but sure. "Do you think we'll ever find another story like this?" Sam smiled, his hand resting over hers. "If we do, I can't think of anyone I'd rather uncover it with." She turned to him, her heart full. "Here's to the next adventure, then." He raised an imaginary glass. "To the next adventure." And as the crickets sang their nighttime serenade, Helen knew she had found everything she'd been searching for: love, purpose, and a place to call home.